This could be the toughest decision one has to make for a long, long time. Do you trust everything Dan Goldman has to say, or anything Marjorie Taylor Greene utters from any orifice? I'll give you a little hint if you're not too sure. Marjorie Taylor Greene is suffering from anaitis in terms of that most of what she says is regurgitated from her backside because she's taught herself how to put her mouth where her a-hole is and her a-hole where her mouth is. And failing that, she just listens to whatever former guy tells her to repeat because she has her head firmly up the you-know-where passage. Just trying to help you out here.
Committee will come to order. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Mrs. Green, for her 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So far today on this very important historic hearing, we've listened to Democrats complain that Republicans have done nothing to stop the border security crisis, pretending that we didn't pass H.R. 2, the strongest border bill that has ever been passed in Congress. All of our Democrat colleagues voted no to that bill. My Democrat colleagues today are complaining that they need more money. Well, it seems to be from listening on this committee most of the time, they want more money to help more migrants come into the country. It's unfortunate that it's about migrants. It should be about Americans. I've also listened to them talk about impeachment. Talking about impeachment, saying that impeachment is not the right thing to do when it comes to Secretary Mayorkas complaining about impeachment hearings. But I'd like to remind everyone that when they impeached President Trump, they introduced articles of impeachment on January 11th, held 0 hearings, and then passed these articles of impeachment on January 13th. Oh my, the hypocrisy. But let's talk a little bit further. Let's talk about something I heard from one of our witnesses today, saying that impeachment is needed or necessary or warranted when this person has acted in the interest of a foreign power, that's an impeachable offense. Well, let's talk about how we could argue Secretary Mayorkas has definitely acted for a foreign power. Former Special Agent for DEA's Special Operations Division testified under oath that the cartels have control over the United States southern border. The cartels, not our government, not our Border Patrol. That's a foreign power. Cartels and coyotes are making around $13 billion a year in human trafficking alone off Joe Biden's open border policies and Secretary Mayorkas's willful disobedience in his job. The revenue is 26 times more than cartels earned under President Trump. 26 times more. That would definitely be helping a foreign power. I'm sure that money's spent in countries like Mexico. That helps their economy. Cartels control approximately 40% of Mexico. The cartels do. That means that this border crisis and the laws that are being broken are definitely in the interest of a foreign power. Now, we're also hearing a debate back and forth about policy. Is it a policy difference, or is it Secretary Mayorkas's disobedience and his willfulness to break our federal laws? I ask that question because I want to know, is it the Biden administration's policy to kill 300 Americans every single day to fentanyl? Is it the Biden administration's policy that cartel members are allowed to come in our country and are released? These are unaccompanied minors. Are they allowed by the Biden administration's policy to come in the country and rape and murder young women? Is it the Biden administration's policy for nearly 100,000 unaccompanied minor children to go missing in our country? Is it the Biden administration's policy for child labor, migrant child labor, that was talked about in the New York Times? Is that the Biden administration's policy? If so, then maybe we shouldn't be having hearings on my articles of impeachment to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, Maybe we should be holding articles of impeachment on the President of the United States. Is that where we're going? What do you think about that, Ms. Pearlstein? Do you think, is it a policy difference or is it Secretary Mayorkas? Which one, Biden, Joe Biden, or Secretary Mayorkas?
My impression of the allegations that the majority has raised here is that they are entirely about policy differences with
Ms. Pearlstein, you've talked about policy in your testimony today. Policy, so that would be Joe Biden. I'm sure you voted for him for president. You've been talking about the Biden administration's policy has been the cause of all of this. So is it Joe Biden's policy, the administration's policy, or is it Secretary Mayorkas?
The Constitution, no matter which official.
Ms. Pearlstein asked you a question. Is it the Biden administration or is it Secretary Mayorkas? Not the Constitution. We're not talking about the Constitution. Is it the Biden administration's open border policies or is it Secretary Mayorkas breaking federal law? One or the other. Because the statistics are clear. Are you capable of answering that question?
I'm not sure. Those were about 4 questions.
No, it's one or the other. Biden administration, open border policies, or Secretary Mayorkas.
One or the other what? Who caused it?
That has caused 300 Americans to die every single day. These 2 women sitting next to you's daughters have been murdered. We're talking about over 100,000, nearly 100,000 unaccompanied minors missing in this country. We're talking about cartel members everywhere, the cartel controlling the southern border. We're talking about the massive increase in statistics. It's either one or the other. It's either the Biden administration's open border policies or it's Secretary Mayorkas.
Ma'am, I'm
Okay, we'll
professor of
take it.
constitutional law.
No, you can't
Okay.
point to the Constitution.
All right, so we're a little over here. Gentlelady yields.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Ivey for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start off, we're going to show a clip from an interview that involved former Secretary Chertoff, and I wanted to play that now, if we can.
I'd like for you both very quickly to weigh in on what happens if the Republican-led Congress goes ahead with this vow to impeach or try to impeach the current Secretary of Homeland Security. Does that mean all the things you suggested don't happen and Congress is just tied in knots? Secretary Chertoff?
Well, it would be a very sad day if in search of what is, again, a political stunt, threatening to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, Congress didn't do the things, for example, that Secretary Johnson just suggested. Maybe adjust the standard with respect to asylum, create more resources that are available to adjudicate, and work out additional ways to fund the effort to undermine the cartels and the smugglers, which are a big part of this. So it would be basically putting form over substance to go through a big performance on impeachment that's never going anywhere, rather than actually working with the administration to solve the problem.
Thank you. And then shortly after that, former Secretary Johnson said, "We can't have a secretary who's distracted by a stunt in Congress and an attempted impeachment." Similarly, we've had other quotes, I think, from Congressman Ken Buck, a Republican congressman, who's raised similar concerns about, well, who stated basically there's no grounds for impeachment. Also, Professor Jonathan Turley, who testified, and Turley's important here because he's the witness that the Republicans called to testify at the oversight hearing that Ms. Green, I think, was referencing with respect to President Biden. And he said that, at that hearing that there was no evidence to impeach President Biden. He sent us a letter to this committee saying the same thing with respect to Secretary Mayorkas. Thanks. So I want to sort of point out a couple of things here with respect to that. To the extent we've had hearings that have discussed this issue of impeachment, from a legal standard, from a constitutional standpoint, the only witnesses who've actually addressed it directly are Professor Bowman, who testified at the last hearing, and Professor Pearlstein, who's testifying today. There's no testimony to the contrary that they've provided that was given by the witnesses that the Republicans have called. And I suggested that's in part, or maybe in whole, because they don't have experts who will come in and say, legal experts, constitutional scholars who are experienced with respect to impeachment, who will come here and raise their right hand and swear under oath that the Constitution justifies impeachment with respect to Secretary Mayorkas in this case. And the absence of the testimony, the ranking member raised due process issues at the beginning of the hearing. I would suggest that this goes to the heart of it. If there's no evidence that the Republicans have presented about actual impeachment, the standard in the Constitution being violated, we should not be moving forward with impeachment under these circumstances. I also note Professor Pearlstein's testimony, the point about even if you don't like the policies that Secretary Mayorkas is implementing, and you impeach him and the Senate removes him, which they're not gonna. We've already heard from senators over there who've said, you're wasting the time, let's focus on actual legislation that they're trying to work out and get done. But even if you remove him, President Biden's just gonna move up the acting administrator, I suppose, acting secretary, who would continue to implement the same policy. So it's a waste of time, as Secretary Chertoff called it. It's a political stunt. But more importantly, I mean, it is a total distraction from actually trying to get the legislation done. It's hard to ignore the fact that the Senate is having bipartisan negotiations on the behalf of the Democrats and the Republicans to try and pass a bill or put together a bill that would address these issues. The White House is working with them. House Democrats are working with them. Only the House Republicans are no-shows. They did the field trip to the border and did the photo op and sent it back. But they haven't decided to move forward with actually fixing the issues on that front. And just the last point I'll make on that front, H.R. 2, there's a lot of talk about that's been passed and it's sitting on, the Schumer's desk, but it's not on his desk, it's in the trash can. And you know what? It's in McConnell's trash can too. And they said that before it was passed through. They said, you got all these poison pill provisions in here. We're not going to move this. Send us something we can actually work with. You didn't, so now they're trying to put a bill together. And everybody's on board with that effort except House Republicans. So if we really want to get something done, let's all come together and work on it so we can pass legislation that addresses the problem. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now.
Condolences. I was a federal prosecutor for 10 years who charged people for gang-related and drug trafficking crimes. Unfortunately, this is not the first time I've had to interact with families of victims, and my heart goes out to you. And I want to apologize in some ways to you that you are here really to share your story, but you're being used as a fact witness for an impeachment investigation, and obviously, given what your experience has been, you don't have the background to understand what a high crime misdemeanor is and how it relates to this. And so I hope that you're handling that okay. One of the things that the chairman said at the beginning of his opening statement was that he wishes that Democrats would turn our sympathy into action, and quite ironically said thoughts and prayers are not enough. At first I thought we were at a gun violence hearing where we were talking about the repeated thoughts and prayers of the 2 mass shootings that happen every day. But I do want to just go through some of the actions, as the chairman pointed out, turn sympathy into action. Because I assume, Ms. Dunn, you would agree, would you not, that it would help to stop the fentanyl trade and fentanyl trafficking from coming into this country if we had more law enforcement officers at the border and more resources and technology to stop the fentanyl from coming in. Do you agree with that?
I disagree with that because Border Patrol is now being used to make sandwiches and to screen people and let them into our country.
Okay, well,
So I disagree with you.
So you're saying that you're upset because the Border Patrol is not doing, is making sandwiches, I think you said. So you don't think it would be helpful to have more Border Patrol officers who are charged with stopping the fentanyl trade?
I would like the Border Patrol to be able to do the job that they were hired to do.
Well,
Every Border Patrol officer that I have spoken to has told me that their hands are tied by this administration and Mr. Mayorkas. I've been to the border, sir. Have you? Have you?
Excuse me, I'm asking the question.
I'm just wondering.
And the problem with that is that in Congress, this Congress, we have interviewed 9 senior officials under DHS in a variety of different capacities. Every single one of them has said that it would be helpful to provide more resources at the border to stop the flow of fentanyl coming in. And that is actually exactly what President Biden has done. In last year's budget, fiscal year 2023, the appropriations included 300 additional U.S. Border Patrol agents, which was the first increase since 2011. Included 125 more CBP officers, $70 million for non-intrusive inspection, and 200 House Republicans, including every single Republican serving at the time who currently sits on this committee, voted against that bill. Under the Biden administration, the Department of Homeland Security has seized more fentanyl and arrested more criminals for fentanyl-related crimes in the last 2 years than in the previous 5 years combined. And even in this Congress, when we had the Department of Homeland Security appropriations markup, Mr. Correa offered an amendment that would provide more money and more resources for the border to stop the fentanyl trade, and every single Republican voted it down. But that's not it. Even with the supplemental request from the White House, they requested $1.2 billion to crack down on the trafficking of dangerous and lethal illicit drugs like fentanyl, including over $300 million for the most effective non-intrusive inspection systems. And of course, 90% of fentanyl comes through the ports of entry, so having those inspection systems would do it. Again, the Republicans will not support the border with additional resources to do the job that the Secretary wants to do. And so we are here yet again for a political stunt to make an argument.
The full 3-hour plus session of today's hearing of the Trumpy Chumps and the Trumpy Chumps within the Republican Party were having a hearing into seeing if they could impeach Mayorkas. It went exactly as you would think it would go. So instead of you having to listen to the 4 hours, I thought I would just select a couple of choice moments. Eric Saul and Garcia doing the job of representatives. Unfortunately, we do struggle trying to find those on the other side of the aisle who are trying to do anything aside from trying to get a few seconds as a soundbite on Fox.
It is not doing anything, even as it is negotiating to try to address the problems at the border, and even as it is trying to increase the number of border agents and technology to address the fentanyl system. Let's stop this sham impeachment hearing, and let's go negotiate with the Senate and the White House, who are doing that right now with Secretary Mayorkas to address the problems at the border. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, for his 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Dunn, I was watching you as we listened to my friend from New York just now and heard what you said. You did a fantastic job sort of defeating his point in the little bit of time he gave you. But as he was saying that they make the issue that Republicans aren't sending more money to the border. What every jurisdiction in the United States, notably New York, Chicago, and others are suffering is a deluge of immigrants that the country cannot assimilate, that are not prepared to be assimilated culturally, by linguistic background, by experience. They're not. We can't get the job done that way. The only proposals that Democrats have offered Let this go down on record. The only proposals that have been offered is to send more money to the border, which will be used to process more immigrants faster into the country, number one. Or number two, to legalize them all, grant them amnesty, as if that would somehow address any of the problems that we're experiencing. Not one of them would be addressed. So I appreciate, Ms. Nobles, you and Ms. Dunn, you for being here. It must be particularly infuriating to hear that when you've suffered the ultimate victimhood from the violations of law that the Secretary of Homeland Security has administered. So, Professor Pearlstein, I want to go to you, though, because I want to talk about that victim, the rule of law. You said in your paper in defense of Secretary Mayorkas that to the extent the majority of reports allegations against the Secretary are related to those policies, in particular the suggestion that Secretary Mayorkas somehow exceeded the scope of his lawful authority to set priorities for the enforcement of U.S. immigration law. That claim has been rejected most recently by an overwhelming bipartisan majority of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, are you referring to the United States versus Texas case from last June?
I am.
But there, the majority opinion says, quote, "We take no position on whether the executive branch here is complying with its legal obligations. We hold only that the federal courts are not the proper forum to resolve this dispute." So when you read that language, how do you come to the conclusion that the court decided that Secretary Mayorkas is acting in accordance with his legal responsibilities?
The basis of the court's ruling on standing that you just described was, as Justice Kavanaugh's opinion for the majority said, the authority to decide how to prioritize and how aggressively to pursue legal actions against defendants belongs to the executive branch under Article 2. That was the basis of the ruling, that was there is no standing in this case.
Well, they also said they've taken no position whether the executive branch is complying with its legal obligations. How is that?
Trump appointed said this is authority that belongs exclusively to the executive branch.
Right. What you're referring to is the court says we're not in the business of refereeing anything where the executive has any amount of prosecutorial discretion. But they also say we're not deciding here whether the executive branch is complying with its legal obligations. Both of those propositions are true. They're both in the opinion, are they not, ma'am?
The court found that there was no standing because...
No, ma'am. I asked you a question. This proposition is in the opinion as well, correct? I read it. It's accurate.
The court found there was no standing. That is also true.
I didn't ask you about standing. I asked you whether this language that I just read, where the court said we're not determining whether the executive branch is complying with its legal obligations, that's also in the court's opinion, correct?
That may be in the court's opinion, but
that's what I asked. Thank you. Let me ask you this. At the oral argument, this was Justice Kavanaugh's question to the Solicitor General. Solicitor General of the United States. I think your position is, instead of judicial review, Congress has to resort to shutting down the government or impeachment or dramatic steps if some administration comes in and says we're not going to enforce laws, or at least not going to enforce the laws to the degree that Congress by law has said the laws should be enforced. And that's forcing, I mean, I understand your position, but it's forcing Congress to take dramatic steps. Isn't that what he said at oral argument?
I don't have the transcript of oral argument.
All right, do you disagree with his proposition as I just recited it to you?
Justice Alito said in his lone dissent that impeachment, along with funding cutoffs and others, were among the potentially available remedies that Congress has. The majority opinion, none of the other 8 justices, including all of the justices appointed by the former president, mentioned impeachment in that context.
So you're aware, are you familiar with the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996?
It's a large act. Which part?
The part that the United States Supreme Court considered in United States versus Texas?
I've read the case.
Okay, you know that, as Justice Alito describes in the dissent, that in that situation, the Congress decided to withdraw some of the discretion that the executive has by requiring detention and specifically in certain cases, right?
What the court said was that for the last 27 years since that law was enacted in their current form, all 5 presidential administrations have determined the resource constraints necessitated prioritization in making immigration arrests.
If you evaded a question like that before the bench, they would not like it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, for his 5 minutes questioning.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Chairman. First, I want to thank Ms. Nobles and Mrs. Dunn for testifying and express my condolences for the loss of your children, and to tell you that I have constituents as well who have lost children to fentanyl. And I know it's not easy to come to Congress and to talk about it, and I hope that what you will find one day is a Congress that will unite and do everything it can to make sure that we reduce these deaths. I also wish we could hear from Secretary Mayorkas because he has stated he wants to come and testify, and I know Mr. Magaziner put into the record a letter from Mr. Mayorkas stating that he again would be willing to testify. He's testified 27 times to Congress, more than any other cabinet official, and twice last year before this committee, and he has made his senior officials available. And to the witnesses who have come here today, if you came looking for an audience that is serious and wants, to take up this issue, I'm afraid you're in the wrong place. I'm afraid that when it comes to immigration solutions, too many of my colleagues would rather have the issue than the fix. And I am speaking for myself here, and I know I probably speak for many of my colleagues. I don't want open borders. I want a secure border. That's why I have supported surging more border agents at the border. That's why I support deploying more technologies at the border. That's why I support having more barriers at the border. And that's why I want to make sure that we also address the workforce crisis in America by, increasing legal immigration and increasing, immigrants who can work the jobs that Americans are just not going to work, so we can reduce the costs and give more financial breathing room to families in this country. You're not going to find that here. This is not where they do that. This is where they seek fame rather than a fix. And what you're going to find here is that if we were to solve this crisis, this committee wouldn't have anything to talk about. And that's more important to the Speaker of this House, and that's more important to the person that too many of them rely upon when they make decisions, which is the former president. I want to just give you a couple examples. Sergeant Daniels, I'm sorry he can't be here today because last time he was here, I asked him if he would support additional Border Patrol agents, as the Senate passed with 68 Republicans and Democrats not too long ago, and he said he would. And I would like to have unanimous consent to enter into the record his written testimony to our committee and to the Oversight Committee where he said that.
Without objection, so ordered.
So then you have, just recently on CNN, Jake Tapper asked Speaker Johnson, look, President Biden wants to give you more money at the border. Would you take that? And Speaker Johnson said no. Again, just revealing and saying out loud what we all know, which is that they don't want to solve this problem. They want to use it and exploit victims so they have a political narrative. Senate negotiations are taking place right now where, in good faith, Democrats and Republicans are working to try and find more solutions and more resources at the border. And that is dead on arrival here, where Republican colleagues have said out loud, we're never going to support that. That would help the president. They've actually said that. My Democratic colleagues want the fix. MAGA Republicans want the fiction. My Democratic colleagues want the fix. My MAGA colleagues want Fox. My Democratic colleagues want the fix. My MAGA colleagues want the fame. That's what this is entirely about. And if you have any questions as to whether that's what this is about, one of the questions earlier was asking a professor who came here to talk about immigration and the Constitution, whether she would condemn Hamas's attack on October 7th. Everyone here condemns Hamas's attack on October 7th. But if that same member was asked, would you condemn Donald Trump's role in the January 6th insurrection, or would you condemn the people on this committee who called the January 6th terrorists hostages, an insult to the actual hostages, American hostages, in Gaza right now, he would take a pass. He wouldn't want to answer the question. They couldn't answer the question because they won't condemn it. They don't want the fix. They want the fiction. If they were not willing to hold Donald Trump accountable for his impeachable crimes, I don't really want their
Gentleman's
hot
time has
take.
expired. The
I don't want
gentleman
their hot
from
take
New York
on Secretary Mayorkas.
is recognized
Yield
for
back.
5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And again, smearing Secretary Mayorkas. Professor Pearlstein, thank you for being here. Are there any grounds, again, for impeaching Secretary Mayorkas under the Constitution?
I don't believe the Constitution supports impeachment in this case.
Thank you. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the most important question and really gets to the heart of why we're here today. We talked a lot about the fentanyl crisis and fentanyl in this committee and today, but the fentanyl crisis we know is a tragedy. But we also, it's important to remember who didn't end the fentanyl crisis. That was actually Donald Trump. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to introduce this article titled Synthetic Opioid Overdose Deaths Soared While Trump Was President. I also would like to, into the record, put this other article, Opioid Crisis, Critics Say Trump Fumbled Response to Another Deadly Epidemic. And I bring these documents up because I think it's really important to note that during Trump's presidency, the fentanyl crisis had already been a huge challenge across this country. In fact, Trump said before the 2016 election, he said the opioid crisis was destroying lives and shattering families. And he said, quote, "We are going to stop the inflow of drugs into New Hampshire and into our country 100%. 100%, Trump promised. In 2017, Trump's first year in office, more than 42,000 Americans died from overdoses linked to heroin, fentanyl, and prescription opioids. There was a huge fentanyl problem when Donald Trump was president. The administration didn't even bother to issue a national strategy on fentanyl in his first 2 years in office. So I think it's crazy that the majority is trying to turn this into a public health crisis that somehow new or began during the Biden administration. Unfortunately, this is about much larger issues that we have, because our conversation today isn't about the Constitution or the law. It's not even about securing the border. The majority is not interested in solutions. Donald Trump, as always, has said the quiet part out loud when he said immigrants, and I quote, are poisoning the blood of our country. As we know, this is rhetoric that can be compared to Hitler and the kind of rhetoric that he used. Extremists here in Congress also continue to push issues like the Great Replacement theory. And we should be clear, immigrants are some of the most patriotic and hardworking people there are in this country. I just heard a committee member say, and I quote, that they are not prepared to be assimilated, talking about immigrants. I'm an immigrant. I think I'm pretty well assimilated here. I am a member of Congress. And so I think it's very un-American to attack and demonize migrants the way that some in this majority continue to do. Immigrants aren't here to poison or victimize the American people. I also want to just touch on this issue of crime. Some in the majority continue to talk about crime, and crime is a horrific tragedy. Clearly, I feel horrible for our witnesses that are here that have lost members of their family. But let's look at real data as well. Both undocumented and documented immigrants are much less likely to commit crimes or be incarcerated than native-born American citizens. Our border communities are often safer from violent crimes than many interior cities. And according to FBI crime data, crime in border communities was measured to actually be 15% lower than the national average. So from a crime perspective, more crime is being committed by American citizens than those folks that are undocumented or that are immigrants. Democrats also want an orderly and secure border. We want real solutions to the fentanyl crisis, but we need to understand the problems we're trying to solve need solutions, legislation, not impeachments of the secretary, and certainly not impeachments of President Biden. The idea that any of these problems will be solved by the border alone, I think, is also crazy. These problems have existed for decades. We haven't had immigration reform or any sort of policy in over 30 years. And without legal pathways, we will never have an orderly border. That is also a fact. And we can't have a conversation with a presidential candidate, a former president, who thinks immigrants are poisoning the blood of our nation, who thinks that we should build a moat with alligators along the border, who thinks that we should put spikes on the wall that he's trying to build, who has said that we should shoot migrants in the legs as they're crossing the border, who thinks we should send missiles into northern Mexico. These are the ideas being offered by the likely nominee of the Republican Party and by many on this committee and in the Republican majority. We need to have real solutions. We don't need Donald Trump's horrific policies to come back to this country, and we certainly shouldn't be impeaching Secretary Mayorkas. And with that, I yield back.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. For months now, we have been